The unveiling of a legacy. From abandoned shelter to a beacon of hope in the Great White North, the biting wind whipped snow against the panoramic windows of the tallest corporate skyscraper in Toronto. Inside, Robert Valmont, his hands trembling, clutched a financial report that had just shattered his world. The numbers, stark and irrefutable, pointed to a clandestine theft within his empire, and the prime suspect was the cleaning department. "Impossible," he whispered, his gaze scanning each line. For years, he'd trusted his cleaning staff implicitly, especially Eleanor Vance. Eleanor, the quiet woman who always stayed late, meticulously cleaning his office long after he'd departed. But the evidence was damning. Expensive supplies, specialized cleaning agents, accessible only to the night crew, were vanishing. The private investigator he'd hired weeks ago had finally delivered his preliminary report. Security footage revealed shadowy figures loading boxes after hours. Robert felt a physical blow, as if his heart had been ripped out. How could the person he trusted most, the one who knew the most intimate corners of his office, betray him so profoundly? That night, as Eleanor concluded her shift, Robert remained hidden in his darkened office, observing her through a sliver in the door. Her movements were the same as always, meticulous, respectful, almost reverent towards each object she touched. Then, something chilled him to the bone. Eleanor approached the supply closet, unlocking it with a key he knew she shouldn't possess. He watched, his breath catching, as she carefully packed industrial-grade cleaning products, specialized disinfectants, and other costly items into a large duffel bag. His heart fractured as his worst fears were confirmed. "I can't believe this," he murmured, the betrayal burning like acid in his chest. He had always considered himself a generous employer, paying fair wages, offering bonuses on special occasions. Why would Eleanor do this? Why risk everything for cleaning supplies? As she left, Robert made a decision that would alter the course of his life. He wouldn't call the police. He wouldn't confront her immediately. He needed to understand. He needed to know why. Silently, Robert followed Eleanor to the parking garage. From his sleek black Mercedes, he maintained a discreet distance as her aging bus pulled away, disappearing into the rain-slicked city streets. His heart pounded with a mixture of anger and disappointment he'd never experienced before. This woman had violated his trust in the vilest way. The bus made several stops before Eleanor disembarked in a neighborhood Robert had never visited. It was an area where asphalt gave way to gravel roads, where houses seemed pieced together from scavenged materials, where poverty hung heavy in the air. Robert's Mercedes felt jarringly out of place as he followed on foot, keeping to the shadows, his anger escalating with each step. What did she need with so many disinfectants? Did she have a side business selling cleaning supplies? The thought of inadvertently funding criminal operations turned his stomach. Finally, Eleanor stopped before a structure that rendered Robert speechless. It wasn't a house, but an abandoned building, its walls cracked, windows boarded with cardboard, its roof clearly on its last legs. The place looked on the verge of collapse, yet Eleanor approached the main door as if it were her home. What is this place? He wondered, confusion gradually eclipsing his rage. This didn't look like the lair of a professional thief. It resembled the refuge of someone desperate. Eleanor opened the door and vanished inside. Robert waited a few minutes before cautiously approaching. The boarded windows offered no view, but he could hear voices inside, voices that froze him in his tracks. They were children's voices. "Mom, you're here," a child's voice exclaimed with pure joy. "David has been coughing all night, and Sophie has a high fever." Robert felt a crushing blow to his chest. Children. Eleanor had children living in this place. His mind began to slowly process a reality he hadn't considered. The cleaning supplies, the specialized disinfectants. What if she wasn't stealing to sell them? He moved closer to a window, peering through a small hole in the cardboard. What he saw through that tiny opening changed everything he thought he knew about Eleanor Vance. Inside the abandoned building, illuminated by flickering candles, were 3 children. A teenager seemed to be caring for 2 younger ones, one of whom was clearly ill. Eleanor, her face etched with worry, was meticulously cleaning every surface, every corner of the precarious dwelling with the supplies she'd taken. Her movements were the same as in his office, careful, methodical, filled with a love he now understood. "Sweetheart, come here," he heard Eleanor say to the youngest child. "We need to help your cough. I can't lose you too." Robert staggered back, tears welling in his eyes. 2? What did that mean? His heart broke, realizing he had misjudged this woman so completely. She wasn't stealing out of greed or malice. She was stealing to survive, to keep her children alive in conditions no human being should endure. Then, a broken child's voice pierced the night like a dagger. "Mom, will Dad ever come back? Will he come help us?" Like he promised before he went to heaven, the ensuing silence was more devastating than any scream. Robert understood then that this woman wasn't just fighting poverty, she was battling the profound loss of someone incredibly important. And while he'd been consumed by a few bottles of cleaning fluid, she had been fighting an epic battle to keep her family alive. Robert remained motionless for several minutes, processing the devastating reality he had just uncovered. His legs trembled as he silently withdrew from the window, his mind struggling to comprehend how he had been so blind to the suffering of one of his most dedicated employees. He returned to his Mercedes, his heart shattered, but he couldn't start the engine. His hands shook so violently he couldn't insert the key. The child's words echoed in his head like a painful refrain. "Dad will come back someday." The innocence of that question, the desperate hope in that childish voice, struck him harder than any business news he'd ever received. He sat there, observing the dilapidated building where a single mother fought to keep her 3 children alive. Through the cracks in the walls, he could see the faint flicker of candlelight, casting dancing shadows that seemed to tell a story of resilience and unwavering love. "My God, what have I done?" he murmured, burying his face in his hands. For weeks, he had been planning to fire Eleanor. He had considered pressing charges for theft. He had allowed suspicion to poison every interaction with her. And all this time, she had been using those products to create a clean and safe environment for her sick children. He remembered all the times he'd seen Eleanor working late, her dedication always admirable, but now he understood it completely. Every extra minute she spent in the office meant additional income for her family, another opportunity to bring home the resources needed to care for her children. Suddenly, he heard voices from inside the house. A crisis seemed to be unfolding. Robert quietly exited his car and approached the window again, his heart pounding with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Mom, David can't breathe well," he heard a young girl's voice exclaim in panic. "He's turning blue and making strange noises when he tries to breathe." Robert watched as Eleanor moved frantically inside, cradling the youngest child while trying to calm him. The scene unfolding before his eyes was heartbreaking. A desperate mother trying to save her child with incredibly limited resources. "Matthew, bring the vaporizer we made with the pot," Eleanor commanded, her voice trembling but firm. "Sophie, help me hold your brother while we give him some steam. We're going to get through this, my love." Robert watched, captivated, as the family improvised medical solutions with basic items. Matthew, the eldest, held a pot of hot water near the youngest child, creating a makeshift vaporizer, while his sister held the baby's head. Their coordination spoke of a routine born of necessity, siblings who had learned to care for each other in impossible circumstances. "Why does David get sick so much, Mom?" Sophie asked, with the brutal honesty only children possess. "Is it because we live here? Because we don't have heating like my friends' houses?" The silence that followed was more eloquent than any answer. Robert saw Eleanor struggle to contain her tears as she continued to apply the improvised steam to her son's airways. The girl's question had touched a devastating truth that everyone in that family knew but dared not fully articulate. "My love," Eleanor finally replied, her voice breaking, "sometimes life throws us very difficult tests, but the important thing is that we have each other, and Mom will do everything possible to keep you well. Dad is watching over us from heaven, and he wants us to be strong." Robert felt tears begin to stream down his cheeks. The strength of this woman, her ability to maintain hope in such desperate circumstances, moved him in a way he had never experienced. His entire life had been surrounded by luxury, by comfort, by immediate solutions to any problem. He had never faced the reality of having to choose between buying medicine for a sick child or paying for a decent place to live. "Mom," Matthew said, his voice cracking with a maturity that tore at the heart, "I won't go to school tomorrow. I'll stay to take care of David and Sophie while you work. Besides, I heard they need help carrying boxes at the Central Market. Can I earn some extra money?" "No, my son," Eleanor replied firmly, though her voice trembled with emotion. "Your education is the most important thing. It's the only way you can have a different life than mine someday. I won't let you sacrifice your future for our current situation." "But Mom, we need the money," Matthew insisted. "And besides, if David gets worse, someone has to be here to take him to the public hospital. You can't miss work because we need that salary." Robert realized he was witnessing a conversation that repeated constantly in this family, the terrible decision between immediate survival and future hope. Every day, Eleanor had to choose between caring for her sick children or maintaining the job that kept them alive. And her children, barely more than kids themselves, We're already shouldering responsibilities that belong to adults. Listen to me carefully, Eleanor said, drawing her 3 children into a collective hug that Robert could clearly see through the window. I know the situation is very difficult right now. I know you're cold, that David is sick, that sometimes there isn't enough food, but I promise you, this will change. Mom is working very hard to find a better place for us to live. Really, Mom? Sophie asked, her eyes shining with childish hope. We're going to have a house with heating, and David will be able to breathe better. Yes, my love, Eleanor replied, though Robert could detect the uncertainty behind that promise. We're going to have a real home, with rooms for each of you, with hot water, with everything you deserve. Robert felt his heart shatter as he realized Eleanor was making promises she likely couldn't keep. With her cleaning lady's salary, even working overtime, it would be almost impossible for her to lift her family out of this situation. Yet, she continued to feed her children's hope, because it was the only thing that kept them united and fighting. It was then that he heard something that completely shifted his perspective on the entire situation. Matthew, Eleanor said softly, believing the younger children couldn't hear. I need you to know something important. At Mr. Valmont's company, lately, I've had to take some things from the office. Cleaning supplies, disinfectants. I know it's wrong, but with David so sick and no money for medicine. Mom, you don't have to explain anything to me, Matthew interrupted with a wisdom far beyond his years. You always do the right thing. If you took those things, it was because you had no other choice. Dad always said that when it comes to protecting the family, a parent does what is necessary. Robert's breath hitched. Eleanor was confessing to her eldest son that she had been taking supplies from the office. But the way she did it wasn't that of a criminal, justifying her actions. It was that of a desperate mother, explaining to her child why she had to compromise her own moral values to keep them alive. But, son, Eleanor continued, tears in her eyes, I want you to understand that this isn't what I want to teach you. Under normal circumstances, I would never take something that doesn't belong to me. Your dad was an honest, hard-working man, and he wanted you to grow up to be people of integrity. What I'm doing now is only until we find a solution. Mom, Dad would do the same if he were here, Matthew replied, hugging his mother. He taught us that the most important thing is to take care of the family, and you're doing exactly that. Robert had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. The conversation he had just overheard had impacted him more profoundly than any previous experience in his life. This woman had been tortured by the guilt of taking those products. She had been teaching her children that what she was doing was wrong, but that sometimes extreme circumstances forced people to make impossible choices. Suddenly, David began to cough violently, a wet, disturbing sound that sent the whole family into immediate action. Robert watched as Eleanor scooped up the youngest child, while Matthew and Sophie scrambled to bring more hot water for the makeshift vaporizer. Easy, my love, easy, Eleanor whispered as she rocked the child. Mom is here. Everything will be okay. Breathe slowly, just like I taught you. But Robert could see the situation was worsening. The child's lips had a bluish tint that was definitely not normal, and his breathing was becoming increasingly labored. It was clear he needed urgent professional medical attention. Mom, Matthew said, his voice filled with growing panic. I think we need to take him to the hospital. He's getting worse. My son, you know we don't have money for a private hospital, Eleanor replied desperately. And at the public hospital, they'll take hours to see us. Besides, they'll ask us a lot of questions about where we live, about our situation. Robert realized that Eleanor was afraid to seek medical help, not only for financial reasons, but also because she feared the authorities would discover the conditions in which she was raising her children. The fear of having her children taken away due to neglect or inadequate living conditions was paralyzing her precisely when she needed to act most. Mom, I don't care what they say, Matthew insisted. If David suffers because we don't take him to the hospital, I'll never forgive myself, and neither will you. Those words were like a stab to Robert's heart. A 1-2-year-old boy was facing the very real possibility of losing his younger brother due to a lack of medical resources. He was watching a family torn apart by love, fear, and desperation. Eleanor finally made a decision that demonstrated the true magnitude of her maternal love. You're right, my son, she said with determination, wrapping David in a worn blanket. We're going to the public hospital. I don't care what we have to face afterward. The important thing now is to save your little brother. Robert watched them leave the abandoned building in the pre-dawn hours. A silent procession of figures wrapped in tattered blankets walking under the rain towards a distant bus stop. Eleanor carried David while Matthew held Sophie's hand. They moved with the desperate urgency of those who know every minute counts. It was then that Robert Valmont made the most important decision of his life. He couldn't stand by, a passive observer, while this family fought for survival. He couldn't return to his warm, comfortable mansion, knowing that just a few kilometers away, 3 innocent children were paying the price for circumstances completely beyond their control. He sprinted to his Mercedes and started the engine. He had to do something. He had to help. But as he drove behind the bus carrying Eleanor's family towards the hospital, one question tormented him. How had he lived 45 years without realizing that this kind of suffering existed so close to him? And more importantly, what kind of man had he become if he was capable of judging a desperate mother without first trying to understand her story? The San Miguel Public Hospital seemed like a labyrinth of despair under the flickering fluorescent lights. Robert arrived just minutes after Eleanor's family, parking his Mercedes in a spot where it unequivocally clashed with the dilapidated vehicles and the constantly arriving and departing ambulances. From the main entrance, he could see Eleanor running towards the emergency counter, with David in her arms, Matthew and Sophie following closely behind. The little boy had worsened during the bus ride. His breathing had become so labored that even from a distance, Robert could see him struggling for each breath. "Please, my son can't breathe." He heard Eleanor cry out to the mid-aged nurse at the desk, a woman who seemed to have seen too much suffering to be surprised by anything. "He's been getting worse all night, and now he's turning blue. Please, you have to help him." The nurse, identified by her name tag as Carmen Ruiz, looked at the child with a professional but understanding expression. However, her next words were like daggers to the heart of anyone listening. "Ma'am, I see your son does indeed need immediate attention," Carmen said, quickly checking David's vital signs. "But I need you to complete these forms first. Personal information, address, medical insurance, payment method." "Forms?" Eleanor interrupted, her voice thick with desperation. "My son is sick, and you're asking me for forms. Please, attend to him first, and then we can fill out all the papers you want. I understand your concern, ma'am, but these are mandatory procedures," the nurse replied with that institutional coldness characteristic of overburdened healthcare systems. "Without complete documentation, we cannot process his admission into the system." Robert watched the scene from a safe distance, feeling indignation surge in his chest. He was witnessing how bureaucracy could become a tragedy for those without resources. While David struggled to breathe, the system demanded his mother prioritize paperwork over her son's life. "Mom, give her the papers she wants," Matthew whispered, trying to be the responsible older brother circumstances had forced him to become. "I can watch Sophie while you fill them out." But as Eleanor began to complete the forms, the cruel reality of her situation became evident. In the address field, she froze. What could she write? Abandoned house, no number, in the marginal neighborhood. Wouldn't that raise suspicions about her ability to care for her children? "Ma'am, I need a valid address," Nurse Carmen insisted, noticing Eleanor's hesitation. "It's required information for the medical record. We're in the process of moving." Eleanor lied, her hands trembling as she held the pen. "We're temporarily staying with some relatives, and the relative's address." Then, Carmen interrupted, her impatience growing. There was a line of people waiting behind Eleanor, and it was clear the pressure of her job was affecting her patience. Robert watched as Eleanor slowly crumbled. She was a proud woman who had worked her entire life, who had maintained her dignity even in the most adverse circumstances. But now, with her son in critical condition in her arms, she was forced to lie and humiliate herself before a system that seemed designed to reject the most vulnerable. It was then that David suffered a sudden crisis. "My baby. Something is happening to my baby," Eleanor cried out as the youngest child. David suddenly worsened, and the entire room froze. The seizures were terrifying to witness. David's tiny body convulsed violently, his eyes rolling completely white. Nurse Carmen finally reacted with the urgency the situation demanded from the beginning. "Code blue in emergencies. I need a doctor here immediately," she shouted, taking David from Eleanor's arms and rushing towards the treatment rooms. "Don't take my son," Eleanor sobbed, trying to follow the nurse. "Please, let me be with him. He's just a baby. He's scared." "Ma'am, you need to stay here while we stabilize the child," a security guard said, blocking her path with that impersonal authority that characterizes rule enforcers without considering the human pain they cause. Family members cannot enter the treatment area during medical emergencies. Robert witnessed Eleanor's emotional collapse. This strong woman, who had faced poverty, widowhood, and the responsibility of raising 3 children alone, finally broke. She slumped into one of the plastic chairs in the waiting room, weeping with an intensity that would break anyone's soul. "Mom, don't cry," Sophie said with that innocent wisdom of children who have seen too much suffering. "David is very strong. Remember, Dad always said our family has warrior blood. David will be okay because he has your strength." The 8-year-old girl's words revealed something fundamental about this family. They had lost their patriarch, but his legacy of strength lived on in each of them. The children's father had clearly been an important figure who had taught them values of resilience and family unity. "How did Dad die, Mom?" Matthew asked, his voice cracking, seizing this vulnerable moment to ask a question he had evidently been suppressing for a long time. "You've never told us exactly what happened?" Robert moved a little closer, undetected, sensing he was about to hear a truth fundamental to understanding this family situation. Eleanor took a deep breath before answering, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Your dad was a welder in construction," she began, her voice trembling. "He worked on very tall buildings, building those metal structures that hold everything up. One day, the company he worked for decided to save money on safety measures. There weren't enough harnesses. The platforms were in poor condition. Did he fall?" Sophie asked with that brutal directness only children can express. "Yes, my love," Eleanor confirmed, hugging her 2 older children. "He fell from the 20th floor because the company didn't want to invest in adequate safety equipment. And when we tried to get them to help us, when we asked for compensation to move forward, they told us it was his fault for not being careful." Robert felt his blood run cold. This family hadn't just lost their primary provider. They had been victims of corporate negligence. A company had prioritized profit over human life, and when the consequences of that decision proved fatal, they had blamed the victim. "Is that why we couldn't stay in our old house?" Matthew asked, connecting the dots with that precocious intelligence developed by children who grow up in adversity. "Exactly, my son," Eleanor replied. "Without Dad's salary, we couldn't pay the rent. The landlord kicked us out after 2 months of arrears. We lost everything, the furniture, family photos, even the toys Dad had bought you for Christmas." The picture forming in Robert's mind was devastating. This family had a normal life, a home, stability. Everything had collapsed due to corporate greed and a lack of social responsibility. Eleanor had gone from being the wife of a respected worker to a single mother struggling to keep her children alive in an abandoned house. "But Mom," Sophie said, with that unshakable childhood hope, "you always say Dad is watching over us from heaven. Do you think he's helping David right now?" "Of course, my love," Eleanor replied, finding strength in the faith that had held her family together. "Dad would never abandon us. He's talking to the doctors right now, telling them exactly how to cure David." It was then that the doctor appeared, a young man who looked exhausted but maintained the professional serenity necessary to deliver medical news. Robert moved close enough to hear everything he had to say. "The Morales family?" the doctor asked, consulting his clipboard. "Yes, I'm the mother," Eleanor replied, standing up immediately. "How is my son?" "He's going to be okay. Your son David has a severe respiratory infection, complicated by malnutrition and prolonged exposure to adverse environmental conditions," the doctor explained with that medical terminology that sounded terrifying to unprofessional ears. "The seizures were caused by a lack of oxygen due to the obstruction of his airways." "What does that mean in simple words, doctor?" Matthew asked, once again assuming that adult role that didn't belong to him at 12 years old. "It means your little brother is very sick because he has been breathing contaminated air and hasn't received adequate nutrition to keep his immune system strong," the doctor explained, demonstrating an empathy that contrasted with the bureaucratic coldness of other hospital staff. "He needs immediate hospitalization, intravenous antibiotic treatment, and intensive care for at least a week." The ensuing silence was more eloquent than any cry. Robert watched as Eleanor slowly processed the implications of those words. Hospitalization meant expenses she could never afford. Intensive treatment meant she would have to miss work, losing the only income that kept her family alive. "Doctor," Eleanor said, her voice trembling, "how much will all of this cost?" "Right now, the most important thing is to save your son's life," the doctor replied, skillfully evading the financial question. "The economic aspects can be discussed later with the billing department." But Eleanor had lived enough poverty to understand that discussing later meant accumulating an impossible debt. It meant that for years she would be paying medical bills that would keep her in absolute misery. "Are there any less expensive alternatives?" she asked, with the desperation of a mother drowning in a sea of impossibilities. "Something I can do at home. I know how to care for sick children. I've been doing it for months." "Mrs. Morales," the doctor said firmly but with understanding, Your son needs medical equipment that only we have here at the hospital. If you try to treat him at home, there's a very high probability he won't survive. Are you willing to take that risk?" The question hung in the air like an emotional guillotine. Robert watched as Eleanor struggled internally between unconditional love for her son and the crushing reality of her financial situation. It was the cruelest decision any mother could face, going into lifelong debt to save her son or risking losing him due to lack of resources. It was then that Robert Valmont made the decision that would change not only the life of the Morales family, but also his own existence. He emerged from the shadows where he had been observing and approached the group directly. "Excuse me, doctor," he said with that natural authority that money and power confer. "I am Robert Valmont, and I will cover all of Diego Morales' medical expenses. I want him to receive the best treatment available, regardless of the cost." Eleanor turned to him, her expression one of absolute shock, her eyes filled with confusion, hope, and terror simultaneously. She couldn't comprehend why her boss, the man from whom she had been taking cleaning supplies, was standing in the emergency room of a public hospital, offering to pay for her son's treatment. "Mr. Valmont," Eleanor stammered. "What? How? Why are you here?" Robert looked her directly in the eyes, and in that gaze was a mixture of shame, admiration, and determination that Eleanor had never seen before. "Eleanor," Robert said, his voice choked with emotion, "I've come to ask for your forgiveness." The silence in the emergency room became so thick, it seemed even the medical machines had stopped making noise. Eleanor looked at Robert with an expression that combined shock, confusion, and pure terror. Her children had instinctively taken refuge behind her, not understanding why their boss had appeared out of nowhere at the most vulnerable moment of their lives. "Forgiveness?" Eleanor repeated, her voice barely audible, as if the words had gotten stuck in her throat. "Mr. Valmont, I don't understand what's happening. How did you know we were here? Why do you want to help Diego?" Robert took a deep breath, knowing the next words would define not only this family's future, but also the kind of man he would become from that moment on. "Eleanor, I need to confess something terrible," he began, his voice trembling with genuine emotion. "For weeks, I've been investigating you. I believed you were stealing cleaning supplies from the office. I hired a private investigator. I reviewed security footage. I spied on you as if you were a criminal." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she understood the magnitude of the situation. Her worst nightmare was coming true. She had been discovered, but what devastated her most wasn't the fear of consequences, but the shame of her children hearing their mother labeled a thief. "Mom isn't a thief," Matthew declared with that protective fierceness children develop when they see their parents attacked. "My mom is the kindest person in the world. If she took those things, it was because we needed them so we wouldn't get sicker." "I know, son," Robert replied, addressing Matthew directly with a respect that surprised everyone present. "And you're right, your mom isn't a thief. I was an idiot who didn't understand anything. Are you going to put us in jail?" Sophie asked with that heartbreaking innocence of children who have learned too soon that the world can be cruel to the vulnerable. "No, my love," Robert replied, kneeling to be at the child's level. "No one is going to jail, and no one will ever hurt your family again." The doctor, who had been listening to the entire conversation with growing fascination, discreetly cleared his throat. "Excuse me, but I need to know if you're going to authorize immediate treatment for Diego. The child needs to be transferred to intensive care right now." "Authorize everything," Robert ordered without hesitation. "The best treatment available, the best room, the best specialists. Money is no issue, Mr. Valmont," Eleanor interrupted, finding her voice despite the overwhelming situation. "I can't let you do this. I have no way to repay you. With my salary as a cleaning lady, it would take me my whole life to pay back that money." "Eleanor," Robert said, standing up and looking her directly in the eyes. "After what I discovered tonight, after seeing how you've been living, after understanding why you were taking those products, I am the one who should be paying. I should be paying for being so blind, so insensitive, so completely oblivious to the suffering happening right under my nose." "What do you mean, after what you discovered?" Eleanor asked, though a part of her dreaded the answer. Robert lowered his gaze, ashamed to admit the extent to which he had violated his employee's privacy. "I followed you to your home. I saw where you live. I saw how you care for your children. I saw how you use those products. I thought you were stealing." Eleanor's expression shifted from confusion to absolute horror. The idea that her boss had seen the deplorable conditions in which she was raising her children, that he had witnessed her greatest shame, filled her with such profound humiliation that she felt physically ill. You saw the abandoned house," she murmured, covering her face with her hands. "You saw how we live. You saw that I don't have hot water, that there's no heating, that my children sleep on mattresses on the floor. I saw an extraordinary mother doing the impossible to keep her children alive. Robert interrupted, his voice firm and emotional. I saw a woman taking cleaning supplies not to sell them, but to disinfect a home where no one should live, but that she is turning into a safe haven for her babies. That's not true, Eleanor exploded, shame transforming into desperation. I'm a terrible mother. My children are living like animals because of me. David is here because I couldn't give him a decent home where he could breathe clean air. Don't say that, Matthew shouted, hugging his mother with an intensity that surprised everyone. You're the best mom in the world. Dad always said you were stronger than 100 men put together. Matthew is right, Sophie added, joining the family hug. Mom, you give us love every day. You make us feel safe. You teach us to be good. That's more important than having a nice house. Robert watched this scene of unconditional love and realized he was witnessing something that he, despite all his wealth, had never experienced. These children didn't love their mother in spite of their poverty. They loved her precisely because she had sacrificed everything, even her dignity, to protect them. Eleanor, Robert said, his voice filled with an emotion he had never allowed others to see in professional contexts. Do you know what the most impactful moment was for me from everything I saw last night? Eleanor looked up, unable to imagine what aspect of her misery had been most memorable to her boss. It was when I heard David asking if Dad was coming back from heaven, Robert continued, his voice breaking slightly. And then, when I saw you confessing to Matthew that you had taken those things from the office, I saw a woman tormented by guilt, teaching her children that what she was doing was wrong, but that sometimes extreme circumstances force us to compromise our values. Because it is wrong, Eleanor murmured. Stealing is wrong, no matter the reason. You weren't stealing, Robert exclaimed with a passion that surprised even the doctor, who had been listening to the entire conversation with growing fascination. Were you taking disinfectant to clean the home of your sick children? Were you using cleaning products to create the most hygienic environment possible in impossible conditions? But they didn't belong to me, Eleanor insisted, clinging to that moral integrity that had been her guide throughout the crisis. You're right, Robert admitted. They didn't belong to you, but you know what? They belonged to me. And if I had been a better boss, a better human being, I would have seen that one of my most dedicated employees was struggling to survive. I would have noticed that you arrived early and left late, not out of ambition, but out of economic desperation. The doctor finally intervened with renewed urgency. Excuse me, but we really need to transfer David immediately. His oxygen levels are dropping again. Go ahead, doctor, Robert ordered. Do everything necessary. I want hourly medical reports. As a gurney carried David towards intensive care, Eleanor collapsed into a chair, overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of the situation. Her two older children huddled beside her, forming that unbreakable family unit that had been their strength during the most difficult months. Mr. Valmont, Eleanor said after several minutes of silence, there's something you need to know. Something about why we ended up living in that abandoned house. Robert sat down in front of her, preparing to hear more details of a story that had already profoundly impacted him. My husband, my children's father, his name was Fernando, Eleanor began. Her voice acquired that nostalgic quality people have when speaking of lost loved ones. He was an industrial welder. He worked in the construction of skyscrapers and bridges. He was a good, hard-working man who dreamed of giving his children a better life than he had had. What happened to him? Robert asked, though he suspected the answer would be painful. He was working on the construction of the new corporate complex, the Platinum Tower, Eleanor continued, unaware of the impact those words would have on Robert. The construction company had decided to save money on safety equipment. The harnesses were in poor condition. The platforms did not meet regulations, but they pressured workers to finish quickly. Robert felt his blood run cold. The Platinum Tower was a project he knew very well. It had been one of his company's most lucrative contracts in recent years. Fernando fell from the 18th floor because the work platform collapsed, Eleanor continued, now weeping openly. When I tried to get the company to take responsibility, they told me it was his fault for not properly checking his equipment. They denied me any compensation and threatened to sue me if I continued to insist. What company was it? Robert asked, though a part of him already knew the answer and desperately hoped he was wrong. Valmont Construction, Eleanor replied. Valmont Industries, the same company where I now work, cleaning the offices of the man whose company killed my husband. The ensuing silence was so absolute that the hum of the hospital's fluorescent lights could be heard. Robert felt as if the ground had opened up beneath his feet. For years, Eleanor had been working for him, cleaning his office, knowing every detail of his professional life, while holding on to the most devastating secret possible. "Did you know who I was when you applied for the job?" Robert asked, his voice barely audible. "Of course, I knew," Eleanor replied with a calmness that dramatically contrasted with the emotional storm in her eyes. "I knew exactly who you were, the owner of the company that had killed my husband and then financially destroyed my life." "Why?" Robert asked, completely overwhelmed. "Why did you come to work for me? Why didn't you confront me? Why didn't you seek revenge?" Eleanor looked at her two children, who had been listening to this revelation, with growing expressions of shock and confusion. "Because I needed the job," she replied simply. "Because my children needed to eat. Because revenge wouldn't bring Fernando back to life, nor would it pay our bills. And because Fernando always taught me that hate only poisons the one who feels it. But I am responsible for your husband's death," Robert stammered, tears streaming down his face. "My company, my cost-cutting decisions, my pressure to deliver projects quickly." "Yes," Eleanor confirmed with a serenity more devastating than any cry of anger. "You are responsible, but hating you wasn't going to feed my children. Working for you, yes." At that moment, Robert Valmont understood that he had been in the presence of a human greatness he could never achieve, no matter how much money he accumulated or how much power he gained. This woman had found the strength to work for the man responsible for her tragedy. She had maintained her professionalism and integrity while cleaning the office of the man who had destroyed her family. "Eleanor," Robert finally said, "there are no words to express how sorry I am. There is no way to compensate for what my negligence caused your family. But I swear to you, by the lives of my own children, that I will dedicate the rest of my existence to mending this mistake." "What does that mean exactly?" Matthew asked with that natural distrust that children develop when they've seen adults make promises they don't keep. "It means your family will never go without again," Robert declared, with a determination that surprised even himself. "It means you will have a decent home, a complete education, guaranteed medical care, and everything your father wanted to give you when he worked on my projects." "Why should we trust you?" Sophie asked with that simple logic of children. "You already hurt us once." Robert knelt again to be at the level of the 8-year-old girl who had just asked him the most important question of his life. "Why?" he replied, his voice choked with emotion. "Your family has taught me tonight what it truly means to be human, and because I will never again allow my ignorance to cause so much suffering." The next few hours at the hospital were an emotional roller coaster that no one in that waiting room would ever forget. Robert had stayed there all night, cancelling important meetings, ignoring emergency calls from his company, completely absorbed in a reality he had never considered, the suffering of the people who worked for him. Every 30 minutes, nurses emerged with updates on David. The little boy had been connected to multiple machines, and his tiny body fighting an infection that had progressed further than initially thought. The doctors had explained that weeks of living in unsanitary conditions had severely compromised his immune system. "Mom, is David going to die?" Sophie asked with that childish bluntness that cuts like a razor after seeing another doctor emerge with a worried expression. "No, my love," Eleanor replied, though Robert could detect the uncertainty behind those words. "David is strong like his father. He will get through this." Robert watched as this family faced the possibility of another devastating loss. They had already lost Fernando. They had lost their home, their financial stability, their social dignity. The thought that they might also lose David was simply unbearable to contemplate. "Mr. Valmont," Matthew said suddenly, breaking the tense silence that had settled in the waiting room. "Can I ask you a question?" "Of course," Robert replied, surprised by the seriousness in the boy's voice. "Do you have children?" The question hit Robert like a punch to the gut. He had children, 2 teenagers living in a mansion, attending expensive private schools, who had never faced a single real hardship in their privileged lives. Children who knew him more as a provider of money than as a present father. "Yes," he admitted in a low voice. "I have 2 children. Sebastian is 6 and Valeria is 5. They know where you are now." "They don't," Robert confessed, realizing he hadn't even thought of contacting his own family to explain his absence. "They probably think I'm in a business meeting or traveling for work." "As usual, as always," Sophie repeated with genuine curiosity. Robert realized that these children, who had tragically lost their father, couldn't comprehend how someone could have living, healthy children, but choose to be absent from their lives. To them, who valued every family moment like a treasure, the idea of a father prioritizing work over family was completely incomprehensible. "My children are used to Dad not being home," Robert explained, feeling growing shame as he verbalized this reality. I've always thought my responsibility was to earn money to give them everything they needed. Big houses, expensive cars, vacations in Europe. But do you hug them? Sophie asked with that simplicity that goes straight to the heart of important things. Do I hug them? Robert repeated, as if the question were in a foreign language. Yes, the girl insisted. We hug Mom every day, many times a day, especially when she's sad or worried. Do you hug your children when they're sad? Robert remained silent for long minutes, processing a question that revealed a fundamental void in his family life. He couldn't recall the last time he had hugged Sebastian or Valeria. His interactions were limited to questions about school grades, money transfers for expenses, and superficial conversations during the rare family dinners. I don't think I hug them enough, he finally admitted, his voice cracking slightly. Dad used to hug us every day, Matthew shared with a nostalgic smile that momentarily lit up his tired face. When he came home from work, before anything else, he would hug us. He said his children's hugs were what gave him the strength to work so hard. And on weekends, Sophie added, joining the family memories, Dad would invent games with us. He would turn the house into a castle, or a spaceship, or a jungle. We didn't need expensive toys because Dad made everything fun. Robert listened to these descriptions and realized that Fernando Morales, an industrial welder with modest income, had been infinitely richer than him in the only things that truly mattered. He had the unconditional love of his family. He had built precious memories with his children. He had been the emotional center of his home. Do you know what we miss most about Dad? Eleanor asked, joining the conversation with a soft voice, but one laden with emotion. What? Robert asked, preparing for another lesson on what it truly meant to be a father. The stories, Eleanor replied with a smile that mingled joy and sadness. Every night, Fernando would make up different stories for the children. Stories where they were the heroes, where they overcame obstacles, where they learned important lessons about being good people. He made them up? Robert asked, fascinated by a concept he had never considered. Completely, Matthew confirmed. Dad said the best stories were the ones that came from the heart, not from books. He told us adventures where David was a superhero who could fly, where Sophie was a princess who saved kingdoms, where I was an explorer discovering new worlds. And always, Sophie added with growing enthusiasm, at the end of every story, Dad would tell us that in real life, we were even more special than in the stories, because we were his real children. Robert felt tears begin to well up again. These children had lost a father who not only loved them, but had invested time, creativity, and emotional energy into nurturing their imaginations, making them feel valued, building their self-esteem day after day. Have your children ever asked you to tell them stories? Eleanor asked with genuine curiosity. No, Robert admitted. They always had televisions in their rooms, video games, computers. I never thought they might want something as simple as their dad telling them a story. Maybe, Matthew suggested with wisdom far beyond his years, they don't know they can ask you. Maybe they're waiting for you to offer. At that precise moment, the chief of intensive care appeared in the waiting room. His expression was serious, but not devastating, which immediately captured everyone's attention. The Morales family, the doctor announced, consulting his clipboard. I have news about David. Eleanor stood up so quickly she almost lost her balance. Her hands trembled as she prepared to hear news that could change everything. How is my baby, doctor? She asked, her voice trembling. David has responded very well to the antibiotic treatment, the doctor explained with a reassuring smile. His breathing has stabilized considerably, and his blood oxygen levels are returning to normal parameters. The relief that washed over the family was so palpable that Robert could feel it physically. Eleanor collapsed back into her chair, this time from pure gratitude, while Matthew and Sophie hugged each other, crying tears of joy. Does that mean he's going to be okay? Sophie asked, needing absolute confirmation. It means we have overcome the immediate crisis, the doctor continued. However, David will need to remain hospitalized for at least another week to ensure the infection is completely eliminated. And after discharge, he will require special care at home. What kind of special care? Eleanor asked, though Robert suspected she already intuited where the conversation was heading. David needs to live in an environment completely free of humidity, mold, and air pollution. The doctor explained with that professional seriousness that indicated there was no room for negotiation. His lungs have been severely affected by prolonged exposure to inadequate environmental conditions. A relapse could be serious. The ensuing silence was devastating. Everyone in that room knew that the abandoned house where the Morales family lived did not remotely meet these medical requirements. In fact, It was precisely the kind of environment that could put David at risk if he returned there. "Doctor," Robert said, standing up with determination, "what kind of housing would be ideal for David's recovery?" "A house with adequate heating and ventilation systems, no humidity problems, preferably with air purifiers, and definitely no exposure to mold or deteriorated building materials," the doctor replied, describing essentially the opposite of where the family lived. "Understood," Robert said firmly. "That will not be a problem, Mr. Valmont," Eleanor interrupted, understanding immediately the implications of those words. "I cannot allow you to do more than you already have. The hospital, the medication, it's already too much." "Eleanor," Robert replied, looking her directly in the eyes, "your son almost suffered because my corporate negligence killed his father and forced you to live in conditions no human being should face. This is not charity I am offering, it is justice." "But a house like the one the doctor describes must cost a fortune," Eleanor protested. "I cannot accept something like that from you." "Why not?" Sophie asked, with that simple logic of children. "If Mr. Valmont has money, and we need a house, so David doesn't get sick, why can't he help us?" "Why, my love?" Eleanor explained patiently. "When someone gives you something very big, they might ask for things in return that you might not be able to give." Robert felt those words hit him like a slap. Eleanor was right to be distrustful. In his business world, all favors came with conditions. All help had hidden costs. All generosities were disguised investments. "Eleanor," Robert said with an emotion he had never allowed others to see in professional contexts, "the only thing I ask in return is the opportunity to be a better man than I have been until now. The opportunity to honor Fernando's memory by doing for his children what he would have done if I hadn't been so irresponsible with workplace safety." "Really?" Matthew asked, scrutinizing Robert's face with that ability of children to detect sincerity or falsehood in adults. "Really," Robert confirmed. "And I also want to ask you all a favor." "What favor?" Sophie asked with curiosity. "I want you to teach me how to be the kind of father Fernando was," Robert said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I want to learn to tell stories to my children, to hug them when they're sad, to make them feel more important than any business meeting." "Seriously?" Eleanor asked, surprised by a request she could never have anticipated. "Seriously," Robert confirmed. "You have lost the best father in the world, but your memories of him can help me become a better father to my own children. That would be the best payment you could give me." For the first time since this long night of revelations had begun, Eleanor smiled with genuine hope. "I think," she finally said, "that Fernando would be very proud to know that his legacy will help another family find themselves." 3 days after the promise made at the hospital, Robert Valmont stood before a beautiful 2-story house in the Los Jardines residential neighborhood, holding the keys in one hand and a purchase contract in the other. It hadn't been an impulsive decision. He had spent 72 hours meticulously researching every detail to find the perfect home for the Morales family. The house had everything the doctor had specified for David's recovery. A central heating system, air purifiers in every room, large windows, allowing abundant natural light, and most importantly, it had been built just 2 years ago with materials completely free of humidity and mold. But Robert had gone beyond the medical requirements. The property had 4 spacious bedrooms, 2 full bathrooms, a modern kitchen with new appliances, a backyard where the children could play safely, and it was located in an area with excellent public schools. It was exactly the kind of home Fernando Morales would have dreamed of providing for his family. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Valmont?" asked Maria Elena Vega, the real estate agent who had handled the express purchase. "It's a very generous decision, but also a very costly one. This property is worth more than many people earn in 10 years. "I am completely sure," Robert replied without hesitation. "Besides, it's not generosity. It's long, overdue justice." While waiting for the Morales family's arrival, Robert reflected on the extraordinary changes that had occurred in his life over those 3 days. He had cancelled important meetings, delegated business decisions he would normally consider crucial, and for the first time in years, he had put the needs of others above his own financial ambitions. More importantly, he had had the most honest conversation of his life with his own children. The previous night, he had arrived at his mansion before 8 p.m. for the first time in months. Sebastian and Valeria were eating dinner alone in the main dining room, as was their usual routine, while he typically worked late or attended business events. "Dad," Valeria had said, surprised to see him at such an early hour. "Is everything okay at the company? We weren't expecting you until the weekend." Those words had broken his heart. His own children were surprised to see him at home during the week, as if his paternal presence were an extraordinary event that only occurred occasionally. I need to tell you something very important, he had said, sitting down with them for the first time in months, and I need to apologize for the kind of father I've been until now. For the next 2 hours, he had told them the whole story. Eleanor, the abandoned house, David in the hospital, Fernando's death on one of his construction projects, and the devastating lesson about what it truly meant to be a present father. Dad, Sebastian had said with a maturity that surprised him, we know you work hard to give us a good life. We've never felt you didn't love us. But, Valeria had added with that direct honesty she inherited from her mother, we have felt that you don't really know us, as if you knew we existed, but you didn't know who we are. Those words had been more impactful than any business criticism he had ever received. His children didn't blame him for working so hard, but they recognized that he had missed the opportunity to know them as individuals, with dreams, fears, and unique personalities. What can we do to change that? He had asked, genuinely interested in hearing their ideas. Well, Valeria had replied after careful thought, you could start by asking us how our day was when you get home, not just if we did our homework or got good grades. And maybe, Sebastian had added, you could tell us stories about when you were a kid. We never know anything about how you grew up, what you liked to do, how you met Mom. Robert had promised that all of that would change, and he had started that very night, telling them about his own childhood, about the mistakes he had made, prioritizing financial success over human relationships, and about how a family in crisis had taught him lessons that no business school could offer. Now, standing in front of the Morales family's new home, Robert felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement he hadn't experienced since he was a young entrepreneur building his first company. But this time, success would not be measured in financial profit, but in the smile of a mother who could finally give her children a dignified home. The taxi stopped in front of the house exactly at 2 p.m. As they had agreed, David had been discharged from the hospital that same morning, and although he still looked fragile, his cheeks had regained some of the healthy pink color of childhood. Eleanor exited the vehicle first, followed by Matthew, who carefully helped David out, while Sophie immediately ran towards the front garden. Mom, look how beautiful these roses are, Sophie shouted, pointing to the rose bushes decorating the entrance. And there's a swing on that tree. Sophie, don't touch anything, Eleanor warned automatically, with the caution of someone who had learned not to expect too much from life. This isn't our house. We're here to see it, but we don't know if. Robert interrupted softly, approaching with the keys extended towards her. This is your house. Completely yours. The ensuing silence was so profound that the wind rustling the leaves of the tree where a swing was indeed installed could be heard. Eleanor looked at the keys as if they were magical objects that might disappear if she touched them. What do you mean, completely ours? Matthew asked with that protective distrust he had developed over months of uncertainty. I mean, Robert explained, kneeling to be at the children's level, that the house is fully paid for, that it's deeded in your mum's name, and that no one will ever be able to take it away from you. Is it ours forever? Truly forever? Diego asked with that small voice that still showed signs of his recent illness, but shone with cautious hope. Truly forever, Robert confirmed, feeling his eyes well up as he saw the astonishment on the little boy's face. Eleanor finally took the keys with trembling hands. For months, she had dreamed of this moment, but she had never believed it possible. She had had nighttime fantasies where she imagined her children running through a real house, sleeping in real beds, bathing in hot water, but she always woke up in that abandoned house where reality brutally struck her. Can we go inside and see it? Sophie asked, practically jumping with excitement. Of course, Robert replied, directing the family towards the front door. It's your home. You can do whatever you want. When Eleanor opened the door, what they found inside surpassed any expectations they could have had. Robert had not only bought the house, he had completely furnished it with everything a family with 3 children needed. In the main living room, there was a comfortable 3-seater sofa, a solid wood coffee table, a large flat-screen television mounted on the wall, and most importantly, a bookshelf filled with children's and young adult books. The kitchen was fully equipped with new appliances, a complete set of dishes, and the pantry was stocked with enough food for several weeks. Mom, there's a staircase, Matthew shouted, running up to the second floor like a normal 1-2-year-old boy for the first time in months. And each room has its own bed, added Sophie, who had followed her older brother upstairs. Robert had paid special attention to the bedrooms. The master bedroom had a queen-size bed with new bedding, a large closet, and a dresser with a mirror. The children's rooms were decorated appropriately for their ages. Matthew's had a desk for studying and educational posters. Sophie's was painted in soft tones with a single bed decorated with new dolls, and David's had a convertible crib that could transform into a big kid bed, along with a special humidifier recommended by the doctors. "Mr. Valmont," Eleanor said, her voice choked with emotion, "this is too much. It's more than I ever dreamed of giving my children. I don't know how we'll ever repay you." "Eleanor," Robert replied, sitting beside her on the new sofa, "do you remember what you told me at the hospital about why you decided to work for me instead of seeking revenge?" "Because revenge wouldn't feed my children," Eleanor repeated, recalling her own words. "Exactly," Robert continued. "Well, this house isn't revenge for what my company did to Fernando. This house is my way of honoring his memory by ensuring his children have the opportunities he wanted to give them." "Mom, come see my room," David shouted from upstairs, his voice filled with a joy they hadn't heard in months. When they went upstairs, they found the three children exploring their new rooms with expressions of pure astonishment. David had discovered that his bed had side rails to prevent falls, but could also be removed when he was older. Sophie was hugging a new doll she had found on her bed. Matthew was reviewing the books on his desk, books appropriate for his age and educational level. "Can I really keep all these books?" Matthew asked, holding up a natural science encyclopedia. "They're yours," Robert confirmed, "and there are more books downstairs in the family library. I thought maybe you'd like to read stories to your siblings, like your dad used to." Matthew's eyes filled with tears. For months, he had taken on adult responsibilities out of necessity, but now he was being offered the opportunity to be an older brother in normal circumstances, to care for David and Sophie out of love, rather than desperation. "Mr. Valmont," Matthew said with a seriousness that was moving, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do your children know what you're doing for us?" The question surprised Robert, because it revealed that Matthew had been thinking not only about his own family but also about how these actions might affect others. "Yes," Robert replied. "I told them your whole story, and they know that you have taught me important lessons about what it means to be a family." "What kind of lessons?" Sophie asked, joining the conversation with that natural curiosity of children. "You taught me that hugging children is more important than buying them expensive things," Robert explained. "You taught me that telling stories at home is more valuable than working late. You taught me that knowing my children's dreams is more important than making more money." "Are you going to start hugging your children more?" Diego asked with that direct innocence that only small children possess. "I've already started," Robert confirmed with a smile. "Last night, I hugged Sebastian and Valeria for the first time in months. And do you know what I discovered?" "What?" the three children asked in unison. "That they also needed those hugs, but they didn't know how to ask me for them." Eleanor, who had been listening to this conversation while exploring the master bathroom with its new shower and hot water, approached the group with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mr. Valmont," she said with a voice laden with emotion, "Fernando would be very proud to know that his story is helping another family find themselves." "Do you really think so?" Robert asked, genuinely needing that confirmation. "Completely," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "Fernando always said that tragedies only make sense if we turn them into opportunities to make the world a little better." "Mom," Sophie said suddenly, "can we invite Mr. Valmont and his children over for dinner someday so we can get to know them, and maybe they can teach us some of the games Dad taught us?" The suggestion took Robert completely by surprise. These children, who had lost so much, who had suffered so much due to his company's negligence, were now offering to share their newfound happiness with his family. It was a level of generosity and forgiveness that moved him deeply. "I would love that," Robert replied, "and I'm sure Sebastian and Valeria would love to meet you too." "Can we show them how Dad taught us to make little theaters?" exclaimed Sophie with growing enthusiasm. "And Matthew can tell them some of the stories Dad made up for us. And David can teach them his favorite songs," added Matthew, holding his younger brother with that protective tenderness he had developed during the difficult months. Robert watched this spontaneous planning for a family gathering and realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. These children weren't thinking in terms of us versus them or poor versus rich. They were simply thinking in terms of families who could help each other be happier. "There's one more thing I want to show you," Robert said, leading the family towards the master bedroom window that overlooked the backyard. In the yard was something that had taken days of special planning: a small raised garden bed with fertile soil, child-appropriate gardening tools, and vegetable and herb seeds that the family could grow together. "Fernando always wanted to teach his children to grow their own food," Robert explained. "Eleanor told me at the hospital that he talked about having a garden where they could learn where real food comes from." "Did Dad tell you that?" Matthew asked, surprised that Robert knew such intimate details about his father's dreams. "Your mom told me," Robert clarified, "and I thought maybe you could teach me too. I've never planted anything in my life." "Yes," shouted Diego, clapping his small hands that already looked stronger after medical treatment. We can plant tomatoes and lettuce and carrots and pretty flowers for Mom, added Sophie, always thinking of making her mother happy. Eleanor approached the window and looked at the garden with an expression that mingled gratitude, astonishment, and profound melancholy. It was exactly what Fernando had dreamed for his family. And although he was not physically present to see it, his spirit and his values were completely alive in this moment. "Fernando," she murmured softly, speaking to her deceased husband, as if he could hear her, "our babies finally have the home you wanted to give them." Robert realized he was witnessing a sacred moment, an instant where love transcends death, and where deferred dreams finally find realization. It wasn't just a house he was giving, it was the materialization of the hopes of a father who had died too soon, but whose legacy would live on in his children. "Eleanor," Robert said, "finally, there's one condition for this house." The instant panic that appeared in the woman's eyes broke his heart, but it was necessary to establish this specific condition. "What condition?" she asked, her voice trembling. "That you allow me to change all the workplace safety policies at Valmont Industries," Robert replied with absolute seriousness. "That you help me implement protocols that guarantee no other worker suffers what Fernando suffered. That you turn your husband's tragedy into the salvation of other workers." Eleanor looked at him for long seconds, processing the magnitude of what he was proposing. "Are you serious?" she finally asked. "Completely serious," Robert confirmed. "I want Fernando Morales to become the name of the strictest workplace safety program in the entire construction industry." For the first time since the loss of her husband, Eleanor felt that the tragedy that had destroyed her life would finally have a purpose that would honor Fernando's memory in the most meaningful way possible. "I accept," she said with a firm voice. "I accept with all my heart." The first family dinner between the Valmont and Morales families took place a week after the house was delivered. Robert arrived at 6 p.m., with Sebastian and Valeria, bringing flowers for Eleanor and educational toys for the 3 children. His children had been nervous all day, unsure of what to expect from this family that had so profoundly transformed their father. The house that was once an impossible dream now overflowed with life and human warmth. The aroma of home-cooked food mingled with the sound of children's laughter, creating that atmosphere of a true home that no mansion could replicate. David had improved remarkably. His cheeks had a healthy color, and his breathing was clear and strong. "Dad," whispered Valeria as they walked towards the front door. "Are you nervous?" "A little," Robert admitted with honesty, "but it's a good nervousness, like when you're about to experience something special." Eleanor opened the door with a radiant smile that dramatically contrasted with the desperate woman Robert had seen at the hospital weeks ago. She wore a simple but clean dress, and there was something in her posture that spoke of recovered dignity. "Welcome to our home," she said with a genuine warmth that immediately put Sebastian and Valeria at ease. The first few minutes were inevitably awkward. Sebastian and Valeria, accustomed to formal dinners served by domestic staff, found themselves in a kitchen where the family itself prepared the food and where everyone was expected to participate in setting the table. "Do you need help with anything?" Sebastian asked, not quite knowing how to offer assistance in an environment so different from his usual experience. "Of course," Matthew replied enthusiastically. "Can you help me carry the plates to the table? In our family, everyone helps with everything." Valeria watched, fascinated, as Sophie helped David wash his hands before eating, as Matthew checked that everything was ready, as Eleanor coordinated activities with an efficiency born of love rather than rigidity. It was a type of family dynamic completely new to her. The dinner consisted of simple dishes, but prepared with care: stewed chicken, rice, beans, a fresh salad from the garden they had begun to cultivate, and homemade tortillas. There was nothing luxurious, but each bite had a flavor that spoke of time invested, attention given, food prepared as an act of love. "In our family," Eleanor explained as she served the plates, "we have a tradition for dinners. Each person shares something good that happened to them during the day and something they are grateful for." "Something good and something to be grateful for," Valeria repeated as if it were a completely foreign concept. "Yes," Diego confirmed with that contagious joy of small children. "I always start because I'm the youngest. Something good that happened to me today was that I could run in the garden without getting tired, and I'm grateful because my chest doesn't hurt when I breathe anymore." The simplicity and depth of those words impacted Sebastian and Valeria. This 5-year-old boy, who had been on the brink of death weeks ago, found joy in being able to breathe normally and run without pain. Their own daily concerns about grades, video games, and social plans seemed trivial in comparison. "I'll go next," Sophie announced. Something good that happened to me was finding a butterfly in our garden, and it stayed on my finger for a long time, and I'm grateful because I have my own room where I can keep all my treasures. What kind of treasures? Valeria asked with genuine curiosity. Pretty stones I find in the garden, leaves with interesting shapes, drawings I make for Mom, Sophie explained seriously. Dad always said the most valuable treasures don't cost money, Matthew continued. Something good that happened to me was that I completely understood my math homework without help, and I'm grateful because I can study at my own desk without distracting noises. Eleanor smiled with maternal pride before speaking. Something good that happened to me today was seeing David playing happily in the garden, and I'm grateful because my children have a safe home where they can grow and dream. They all turned to Robert, Sebastian, and Valeria. It was their turn to participate in this family tradition, but none of them had ever reflected on their day in such an intentional way. We've never done this before, Robert admitted with honesty. But I want to try. Something good that happened to me today was seeing David smile when he ran to the door to greet us. And I'm grateful because you are teaching me how to be a better father. Sebastian hesitated before speaking. Something good. I think something good that happened to me was meeting Matthew and realizing that there are people my age who are much more mature and responsible than I am. And I'm grateful because Dad is learning to spend more time with us. Valeria was last. Something good that happened to me was seeing how Sophie takes care of David. It made me think about how I can be a better older sister, and I'm grateful because this family is showing me what it truly means to love each other. The ensuing silence was filled with warmth and connection. It was evident that something fundamental had begun to change in the dynamic of both families. Now, Matthew announced with enthusiasm, it's story time. For the next hour, the Morales children shared the stories Fernando used to tell them, but with a special twist. They invited Sebastian and Valeria to be characters in the adventures. Sophie invented a story where Valeria was a scientist princess who saved kingdoms with her experiments. Matthew created an adventure where Sebastian was an explorer discovering lost civilizations. David, with the help of his siblings, told a story where they were all superheroes working together to make the world a better place. Robert watched this interaction and realized that his children were experiencing something they had never had. The pure joy of shared imagination, of creating fantasy worlds with other children, or of being valued, not for what they possessed, but for who they were as people. Dad, Valeria asked when the stories were finished, can we do this at home too? Dinners with gratitude and stories. I would love that, Robert replied, feeling more connected to his children than he had in years. As the night progressed, the conversation became deeper. Eleanor told Sebastian and Valeria about Fernando, not as a tragic figure, but as a loving father who had filled their lives with joy and valuable lessons. What do you miss most about him? Sebastian asked with genuine curiosity. His laugh, Diego replied immediately. Dad used to laugh so loud when we played, and the whole house filled with happiness. His bear hugs, added Sophie. He would hug us so tight that we felt nothing bad could happen to us while we were in his arms. His advice, said Matthew, with the seriousness of someone who had had to grow up too quickly. He always knew exactly what to tell us when we had problems or when we were confused. But you know what's most incredible? Eleanor added with a smile full of love. All those things we miss about Dad are still alive in you. David has his joyful laugh. Sophie gives hugs that heal the heart. And Matthew has that special wisdom to help others. Really? Diego asked, his eyes shining. Absolutely, his mother confirmed. Dad lives through you every day. This conversation had a profound impact on Sebastian and Valeria. They realized that they had been taking their father's presence for granted, without appreciating the opportunities to create meaningful memories and connections while it was still possible. Dad, Sebastian said later that night on the way home, we could start doing things together on weekends. Not expensive things, but things like what Matthew's dad used to do with them. What kind of things do you have in mind? Robert asked, excited by his son's initiative. Maybe we could learn to cook together, Valeria suggested. Or do projects in the garden, or just sit and talk without the television or phones. That sounds perfect, Robert replied, feeling his heart fill with a happiness that no business success had ever provided. 3 weeks later, Robert was in his office, but this time not working late. It was Friday afternoon, and he had established a new personal policy: no more work after 5 p.m. on Fridays, and weekends were sacred for family. Eleanor had begun working as a workplace safety consultant for Valmont Industries, helping to design protocols that would protect other workers from tragedies like the one Fernando had suffered. Her intimate knowledge of the human consequences of corporate negligence had made her a powerful voice for change. "Mr. Valmont," Eleanor said, entering his office with a folder full of documents. "I have the final report on the new safety measures for the Fernando Morales program. Over the past few weeks, they had worked together to implement the strictest workplace safety standards in the industry. Top-quality protective equipment, mandatory daily inspections, comprehensive training for all workers, and an emergency fund for the families of any employee injured on the job." "What are the results?" Robert asked, although he already knew the answer from the weekly reports. "Zero workplace accidents in all our constructions over the past 3 weeks," Eleanor reported with evident pride. "Workers say they feel safer and more valued than ever before." "And the financial impact? The initial costs were significant," Eleanor admitted. "But the savings in insurance, legal claims, and lost time due to accidents are already offsetting the investment. Furthermore, our reputation as a responsible company is attracting better workers and more prestigious contracts." Robert smiled, remembering how he used to think workplace safety was an unnecessary expense that reduced profits. Now he understood it was an investment in human lives that also turned out to be an excellent business decision. "Eleanor," he said, closing the folder, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you ever feel that Fernando would be proud of what we've accomplished?" Eleanor smiled with that serenity she had developed during months of healing. "Every day, especially when I see other workers returning safely to their families, knowing that their children won't go through what mine did." "And your children? How are they adapting to all the changes?" "David is completely healthy. Doctors say there are no traces of the respiratory infection," Eleanor reported with maternal joy. "Sophie is flourishing in her new school. Her teachers say she's a bright and compassionate girl." "And Matthew? What about Matthew?" Eleanor continued with pride. "Matthew surprises me every day. He started talking about studying civil engineering when he grows. He wants to design buildings that are completely safe for all workers. He wants the name Morales to be synonymous with safe construction." Robert's eyes welled up with tears. Fernando's son had not only overcome tragedy, but was transforming it into inspiration to dedicate his life to protecting others. "Eleanor," he said finally, "I want to make you a proposal." "What kind of proposal?" "I want to establish a university scholarship fund in Fernando Morales' name," Robert explained with growing enthusiasm, "for the children of construction workers who want to study engineering, architecture, or any career related to making the industry safer. I'm serious, completely serious, and I want you to manage that fund," Robert continued. "Who better than Fernando's widow to decide which young people deserve the opportunity to turn tragedies into solutions?" Eleanor was speechless for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what Robert was proposing. "Do you know what this means?" she finally asked. "It means Fernando Morales will become a force for good that transcends his own death," Robert replied. "It means his legacy will save lives for generations." "I accept," she said with a firm and emotional voice. "I accept with all my heart, and in Fernando's name." That same evening, in the house that now overflowed with life and happiness, the two families gathered again for dinner. But this time, there was an additional tradition. At the end of the meal, they would light a special candle in honor of Fernando Morales. "Dad," Sophie said, addressing the candle as if Fernando could hear her. "Today, Mr. Ricardo told us about the scholarships that will help other children study to do safer jobs. Are you proud of us?" At that moment, as if the universe wanted to answer the girl's question, a gentle breeze moved the curtains by the window, causing the candle flame to dance in a special way. "Dad is here," Diego whispered with the absolute certainty of small children. "He's telling us he's proud." Robert watched this scene and realized he had witnessed the most extraordinary transformation of his life. A tragedy had been converted into redemption, an injustice had been transformed into justice, and a death had given life to a legacy that would protect countless future families. "Do you know what the most incredible thing about this whole story is?" Robert said, looking at all the children present. "What?" they asked in unison. "That Fernando Morales will never just be a name on a tombstone," Robert explained with deep emotion. "He will be the name on university scholarships that help young people study. He will be the name on safety protocols that save lives. He will be the name that other workers remember when they return home safely each night. And he will be the name we carry with pride forever," added Matthew. With that maturity he had developed through adversity transformed into purpose. "Exactly," Robert confirmed. "Fernando Morales has become immortal, not because he is physically with us, but because his love, his values, and his sacrifice continue to make the world better every day." At that moment, with two families united around a table, with a candle honoring the memory of a good man, and with the future shining with promises of lives saved and dreams fulfilled, everyone understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Fernando Morales' death had been a tragedy, but his legacy had become the most beautiful story of redemption, love, and hope that any of them could have imagined. And every time a worker returned home safely, every time a young person received a scholarship to study, every time a family didn't have to suffer what the Morales family suffered, Fernando Morales would continue to live, because true love never dies. It only transforms into ever more beautiful ways of making the world better.